Hey everybody. So I want to talk about David Krejci on the Boston Bruins a little bit because he is really looking good as the Bruins' first line center with Patrice Bergeron out. Um, Krejci has been phenomenal since getting moved up to play with Brad Marchand and David Pastrnak on Boston's first line. And Krejci is really, his numbers are looking like the old David Krejci, the guy who used to score 60 to 70 points a year as a second line center and was really made a great 1-2 punch at down the middle for the Boston Bruins. Over the last few years, he's had injury problems. His game has really slowed down a little bit. He's in his 30s now. He's 32 years old. Things were kind of not looking great for David Krejci. The last few years, his production had really fallen off. But not this year. He's picked it right back up this year. And this role he's getting on with Bergeron out has really lifted his game back to the old David Krejci level. Now, part of the reason his game has really dwindled over the last few seasons has been he hasn't had good line mates. Krejci is not a guy who's going to do everything himself and carry the line himself. He needs to play with good players. And back when he had Milan Lucic and Nathan Horton on his wings, he was putting up really high point totals. Or going back when the Bruins had these guys that he could play with, going back to when he was on the third line with Blake Wheeler, a very young Blake Wheeler, and Michael Ryder in Boston. He had a great season that year. When he has good wings, he's a productive player. He's mainly a playmaker and assist guy. He doesn't score a lot of goals. Over the last few seasons, he has not had consistently good wings. He hasn't had any consistent wings who he plays with on a regular basis. He's had a lot of kids he's had to play with, and it just hasn't worked out. It hasn't been, the most productive David Krejci trying to get him to play with all these different young kids. So, Patrice Bergeron goes out after the Dallas game a while ago now for Boston. But they don't really, Krejci continues to play with DeBrusk and whoever else they put on that right side, whether it's Donato, whether it's Backus, anyone. It's been a slew of different players on that right side. DeBrusk goes out, so he's had a concussion, and a few games ago, I think it was the Toronto game. The Toronto game, Boston's coming off 3 losses in a row. They lose to Detroit, then they get blasted by the Florida Panthers, and then they lose a tight one to Tampa Bay. So they're losing they've lost 3 in a row, and they're playing Toronto, who's a very good team, a division rival. So Boston tries this new thing out. They take David Krejci and put him between Brad Marchand and David Pastrnak, which is normally Patrice Bergeron's spot, and then I think Colby Cave was in that spot for the first part of the time when Bergeron was out, but they take Krejci and they put him there, and since then Krejci has been phenomenal. In those 7 games since he's moved on to this line with Marchand, Krejci, and Pastrnak, Krejci has 4 goals, 6 assists, and 10 points in those 7 games. And that brings his season total to 7 goals, 23 assists, and 30 points in just 35 games. So Krejci is almost a point-per-game player at this point in the season. And a lot of it's had to do with since he's moved on to this line in those last 7 games. He has been fantastic since moving up to play with Marchand and Pastrnak. And I think that shows that when you give Krejci good line mates, he can still produce, even at 32 years old, even though the last few seasons he hasn't been producing at a high level. When you give him good line mates, he can still produce. And he's looked really, really good on that line. So, that gives Boston some options here, because Patrice Bergeron is almost back. Patrice Bergeron is maybe going to return at some point this weekend for the Bruins. He's been practicing. He's cleared for contact. He's going to be back soon. He'll either return one of the 2 games this weekend for Boston, or he should absolutely be ready the first game back after the Christmas break. But Krejci is playing so well with Marchand and Pastrnak that I would not break that lineup. Because Krejci has proven that when given good line mates, he can produce at a high level. But if you move him back off of that line and give him, back to playing with kids, he hasn't been as productive. And he's not the kind of player who's going to lift the people around him and make them better. He needs good people around him for him to play at a high level. And that's not a knock against David Krejci. That's just the way he is. That's the kind of player he is. He needs good people around him, and when he has good people around him, like Marchand and Pastrnak, he can perform and produce at a very high level. So I would keep this Marchand, Krejci, Pastrnak line together and put Bergeron down to the second line between whoever, whether it's Donato and somebody, or DeBrusk is still out with a concussion. Eventually it would be DeBrusk on the left side, Bergeron in the middle, and whoever on the right, probably Donato. But you have to think, like, Bergeron is the kind of guy who can lift the players around him. And he's so good in all 3 zones on the ice that he can take, okay to decent players and make them good players. David Krejci can't do that. David Krejci needs good players around him for any of them to be good. Bergeron is the kind of guy who can lift everyone around him. So he can take a line of DeBrusk, Bergeron, and Donato and make them a lot better than a DeBrusk, Krejci, Donato line would be, which, as the Bruins have seen this year, isn't all that spectacular. So I would keep the Krejci, Marchand, Pastrnak connection going together. And that gives you one great scoring line. And then let Bergeron play the second line and have him lift whoever he's playing with. And then that gives you 2 lines, which Boston hasn't really had all year. Boston has not had 2 consistent scoring lines at all season long. At the beginning of the year, it was Marchand, Pastrnak, and Bergeron, and they were doing most of the team's scoring. And no other line was really producing. Now that Bergeron's out, it's the Krejci, Marchand, Pastrnak line. No one else is really scoring all that. Well, they've gotten some decent contributions from actually the Colby Cave line with Backus and Nordstrom. That's been a really good line. And the kid line, the all-college kid line of Heinen, Forsbacka, Carlson, and Donato have been pretty good. But again, it's this Krejci line doing most of the scoring, a bulk of the scoring. They need 2 consistent scoring lines, and they haven't had that all season long. When Bergeron comes back, he can make you a second consistent scoring line because he's Patrice Bergeron. He's that good. Then you keep this Krejci line together, and now you finally have 2 consistent scoring lines. And that would be game-changing for the Bruins, because they're a playoff team already. They're in playoff position. They've been in playoff position all year long. Even with the major injuries that they've had, they've been able to stay above that cutoff line for the playoffs. They're a good team. They're a very good team. But one thing, they would become an even more dangerous, a great team if they can get 2 consistent scoring lines, because they haven't had it. And I think Krejci should remain between Marchand and Pastrnak until that stops working, until they stop producing. And then you can move Bergeron back there, and Bergeron will immediately lift that line back to how they were before he got injured. But I would give Bergeron the second line and let him elevate that second line and do what he does and make them better. Because Krejci can't make them better, but Bergeron can. And then Krejci can be the great producer that he is between Marchand and Pastrnak when he has good players around him. So that's my thoughts. But Krejci's having a spectacular season and has really, really blossomed playing between Marchand and Pastrnak. It shows that he can still play when he has good players around him, but he's not going to elevate these younger kids who aren't playing all that well. He's not going to make them great. Bergeron can make them great. Krejci needs greatness around him, and then they all can produce at a high level. So with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media, check out offthewallhockey.com. All those links are down in the description below. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our Patreon and merchandise store are in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.